I'm Ashley Gordon.
And I'm Kirk Kerna.
And this is Reading for the Rest of Us.
And this is our second show of our second season.
Yep.
And we're kicking off a series that we've decided to do where occasionally we will revisit historic years. And so for this episode, we thought what we would do is we would look at the year 1964.
And here's how we got to this year first. So this year turns out to be the 50th anniversary of The Giving Tree, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Harriet the Spy, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and we don't have it here, but Flat Stanley. And so there was lots of coverage in news and publishing circles about how interesting that all these books happened at the same time. And just by way of footnote, Where the Wild Things Are was not last year, a year earlier in 1963. So all of those books coming out all at the same time and what was happening. And it turns out that what was happening in 1964 was Kirk was being born.
Well, that's not what we're celebrating, but it is interesting that 64 is a very historical year in terms of...
Not least because it was yours.
Well, aside from that, I think I'm only number 60 on the list of important events.
Okay.
But, of course, 64 was a historic year in terms of politics, in terms of race in America, in terms of culture. And so we thought it'd be fun to explore these years and to try to figure out exactly how the book market or book people's reading related to some of those events. Part of the reason I wanted to start with 64 is because one of my favorite collectible books that I have came out in that year, and it is a novelization of the Beatles' first movie, A Hard Day's Night. Now, just tell you a little bit about this specific book. This was a book that I grew up as a kid having in our house.
Who bought it?
I'm assuming it was my mother because I don't think my father was much of a Beatles guy. I'm not sure my mom ever was. We have no clue how this ended up in our house, but it was there all the time I was a child. And so when I first went to college,
Wait, stop. So it was in the house. Where in the house did it live?
Well, we had a basement.
Give us a little,
we had a basement,
atmosphere.
and all the family books were kind of
segregated,
stored in an odd little piece of furniture. It was like a coffee table, but it had a little opening, and there were all kinds of books in there. So my childhood
what could fit in
reading.
a coffee table?
Well, these were the important books. There
Okay.
were all other kinds of books, but those were basically, I think, my mother's old books that she would toss in there. And I'm glad that I grabbed this and a few others that didn't come out in 64.
Do you remember finding it?
Oh yeah, I remember being a kid and remember taking it, because it has pictures in it, so of course as a child I was all into the pictures. But, and it was years, I read this years before I ever saw the movie Hard Day's Night, which just came back out this summer.
Did you like the Beatles' music?
I'm
totally throwing you off, whatever you had planned to say.
I really did not know much about the Beatles at that time because, of course, this was long before music was sort of available whenever you turned around. So it wasn't like you could go stream them or download them on your iPod back in those days. So it was a few years even before I knew the Beatles' music. So interestingly, my introduction to the Beatles is through a book.
You have to be one of maybe 5 people in the entire universe who discovered the Beatles through their literature.
Well, sure, and I'll be very upfront and admit that I've seen Hard Day's Night 4 or 5 times now, and it actually came out this summer in a remastered version, updated for the 50th anniversary. I actually like the book better than the movie, so that tells you something right there.
And you became an English professor. Well, what a shock.
Because of this. There's some great lines in here. Some great lines in here. It's interesting the way, if you talk about serializations, the way that they fleshed out the characters of each of the Beatles, you know, the silent one and the cute one and all of that, to really make the story go. So this is a book that's in my house that nobody but me is allowed to touch.
This is like an early incarnation of fan fiction, but it was a different kind of fan.
Yeah.
And I was reading just yesterday about a woman who wrote a novel, like self-published it online, about one of the guys in One Direction.
Really?
Uh-huh. Which I have to admit, I only vaguely know who that is. It's
I was going to
apparently
say,
a boy
I'm going to
band.
ask that that's a band.
It's a
That's
boy
okay.
band. One Direction, it's a boy band. I
All right.
think it's today's version, obviously not the Beatles, but today's like girls faint
Okay.
when they see them. And so this grown woman who's had sort of a, I could be getting this totally wrong, who had kind of a love interest from afar in this young man. And so she writes some fan fiction, and she just signed her novel to a major house at the Frankfurt Book Fair.
Wow.
Last week. So this is the evolution of taking one cultural medium, i.e. music, not that you knew that when you found it in the coffee table, one cultural medium and translating it to another and helping those fans cross that bridge.
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, I sit there, you know, I always wondered at the, you know, in the 60s, and of course, books like this were really kind of disposable tie-ins, I guess you would call them, where companies would come out with, I think the technical term is serialization, not serializations, moviezations or something.
Yeah, movie tie-ins is
movie
what,
tie-ins.
or gimmick would be the
Yeah,
other
exactly.
word that comes to mind.
It's basically merchandising, where they're trying to get more money out of it, and so it's just an interesting little artifact that I grew up with, and I've always kind of kept it nearby.
When did you realize it was published the same year you were born?
Probably early on, you know, because
Maybe that's why you bonded
your
with it.
sense of history, I guess. You know, I remember growing up being very fascinated by history and by what year movies came out, and eventually I do think it kind of tied me into what year books came out. I'm embarrassed to admit that I didn't realize that all these classics of children's literature all came out within a single year, though. So.
Well, I'm not sure anybody knew until their publishers'
Right.
marketing departments figured it out.
You know, one of the things that really I think is fascinating to me is I also forget all the time that Ian Fleming wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Yes,
So
people often do.
tell us a little bit about your connection to Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and what you think of that book.
Well, I got to that book backwards, kind of the way you got to the Beatles. I was reading, well, I guess it was, you start with the movies, with the James Bond movies when you're
Right.
growing up in the 70s, and then you want to know where these came from, so then you go read the books, and then you discover that there is a correlation. So I think I read Chitty Chitty Bang Bang probably first when I was 10 or 11, which is about the right time. He actually told the story, this is not unlike Alice in Wonderland, he told the story to his son, orally, as it said in the article. So, you know, bedtime story, and he's making it up over a course of nights. And he was ill, apparently from heavy smoking and drinking.
Yeah.
And in his recovery time, he was bedridden. And so he wrote the story down, but unfortunately died before it was published. So
I was going to say he died in 1964.
yeah,
in
so it all
August of
happened
that
fairly
year.
in a
Yeah.
compact time. But it was quite widely, I lost my train of thought. I mean, lost the word. It was very popular when it
Yeah.
first came out.
You know, I remember, I did, this is a book I did not read as a child, but I do remember the movie, and in fact I had
The movie is it's sort of dreadful.
Yeah, I had a little Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car, and it was a little toy car, and you pressed a button and the wings on the car flew out, so you could pretend you were flying it around. Probably the book would have been a better gift, to be perfectly honest.
It might have been, actually. The movie was Hollywooded up.
Right.
The book is a little grittier.
Mm-hmm.
The book, you really see Ian Fleming's side, his love of cars, for instance. You can just get a sense that Q's in there somewhere
Okay.
with the car. And they're gangsters and a mad scientist. And so it's, the book, quite frankly, I think is more fun than the
Well, he was
Silly Toot Toot song.
he was writing this in between, still writing some James Bond before he died, because didn't he finish 2 or 3 before he died, and I think For Your Eyes Only came out the year. Is that the one we were just talking about?
The Man with the Golden Gun came out the year after.
Okay. Okay.
And
there's a few others
yeah,
in there
they're
that he
all
was
right
able
there together.
to finish, but. Yeah, it's a fascinating story about Ian Fleming, and like I said, I think people just forget that he wrote this book. There's another classic, one of the other ones that I think most of us grew up reading, which is Charlie and the Chocolate Factory.
Right.
And we were sort of laughing off camera because this is the cover now I did read this as a
That's
child.
the American cover from
Right.
1964.
The published version as we know it, and we remember it, because the movie version, the movie version that we grew up with is relatively similar to the book. I think the later movie version even follows it more.
It does.
But you were telling me that the original draft version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is way different.
Very different. And those two books followed a similar trajectory. They both had movies made in the 70s, so they were dramatized, and that helped extend their life.
Right.
Chitty Chitty Bang Bang then became the basis for a West End London play. So it didn't have the second movie like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but it did have yet another incarnation. And that, I think, is one of the interesting things. Your book, alas, maybe is not still picked up on a regular basis, but
Right.
all of these books are still read, and they still sell fairly regularly.
Yeah.
And probably not just because of the movies, because obviously the other two that we may get to, Harriet the Spy and The Giving Tree, didn't have dramatizations. Or maybe Harriet did, but it was a bomb.
I think there was one years later.
Yeah, maybe
in
it
the
wasn't.
90s, if I
Yeah,
remember
and
right.
didn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
But you asked me about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So one of the other things these books have in common, which is also quite interesting, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang not so much, but the other three definitely, is that they make adults really uncomfortable.
Right.
And they're fairly dark, which Chitty Chitty Bang Bang is, of course, because kidnappings and gangsters. And so they all deal with a dark side of life. And when Roald Dahl originally wrote the book, at least some of the drafts that have subsequently been found, it wasn't just a handful of children that got the chance to go to the factory. It was hundreds of children that got to go to the factory. And then they all were eliminated, which would be a euphemism for murdered. I never think about kids actually getting axed in this book, but they do. And so the publisher said, no, I'm really sorry, but you can't off about 100 kids in this novel. And so he downed it to like 20. And they said, no, you really cannot off 20 kids either. So it was
think
darker
about some
to
of the
begin
things
with.
that happen, and it really is. You wonder how you did not have nightmares as a child reading some
But
of
we
this
didn't,
stuff.
and we love it. And look how
Yeah.
popular it still is. And we think of it as a happy book of familial love
Sure.
and second chances. And
Well, and I think it's an interesting period where the young adult market or the children's market really became,
there was a seismic shift.
yes, it became more adult in its concerns, and that lasted really on through the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
It's not like today, it's almost the reverse of today. There's a big controversy today about adults reading YA literature, and yet I think back then, 50 years ago, is when the children's literature began to absorb.
To grow up.
Yeah, to grow
Well,
up.
Where the Wild Things Are, as we said, which was published a year before, was one of the first. Max seemingly from a divorced family,
Right.
and he misbehaves, and that was one of the first where we had also child psychologists and people suddenly looking at how do we talk to children.
Yeah.
And so all of these books really, not unlike Grimm's fairy tales in some way, are where children are. And one of the things I read about Harriet the Spy, it said the book still feels powerful and fresh because it deals so honestly with the reader. No condescension, no fakery, nothing stilted about it. Every time I read it, I'm overcome by the certainty that Louise Fitzhugh said exactly what she wanted to say. And now with the fantasy that's become so popular, it really is interesting, adults reading YA, and what they're really reading is fantasy.
Yeah.
But one of the most popular being the Hunger Games, where children are quite literally pitted against each other to the death.
Right.
So have we changed or not? And
Well, I think it's interesting because I think we really see the blurring of kind of what might be called age appropriateness reading, and it's so controversial where people get very judgmental about it very quickly.
Well, but they always have. The Giving Tree is one where it actually had a hard time even finding a publisher.
Yeah.
At first, publishers said, well, this is an adult book. This isn't for children. And then it was, well, this is too short. And then it was, this is too dark. And so it finally comes out, and 10 million copies later.
That shocks me because that is probably one of the most divisive children's books that I could ever name.
You know, I came to Shel Silverstein through Where the Sidewalk Ends and some of the fun poetry, and had read it aloud to my children as well. So grew up with it, then shared it. And somehow I had missed the Giving Tree until reading about this 50th anniversary. And I read the book, and I was frankly horrified.
Yeah.
Oh, this is awful.
Yeah.
It's just awful. So I kind of missed the love.
Okay.
I would love to have, we're on Facebook, of course, and I would so love to hear from people who grew up loving the Giving Tree and who give it as a gift.
What the message is that you don't like.
Well, and that's argued about as well. So the Giving Tree just continuously gives. There's a little boy, and then there's the more adult-seeming female tree.
Right.
And when he's small, she gives him her apple, and then she gives him her leaves, and he never says thank you. He never seems to acknowledge what she's done, and he goes off and then comes back, and by the end of the book, which I'm not giving away, it's only like 15 pages. She's giving him her leaves and her trunk and her everything, and she's a stump. And he's this grizzled old man sitting on top of her. And so some of the commentary has been, apparently religious groups picked it up as unconditional love and the giving and giving and giving, whereas less religious perspectives were, this is what love can be when it hurts.
Yeah.
This is what love is when you go too far.
You know, it's interesting because as with any sort of classic book, there's all kinds of interpretation. I've even seen ecological interpretations
there's that as well.
of the Giving Tree that really talk about the sort of the plundering of the earth and the resources. And it's interesting that in the 60s we have this whole build-up about environmentalism that really takes off, I think, in the 70s. You know, to me, 1964, another reason that it's an interesting pivotal year, and this kind of relates to the whole Beatles thing in a little bit. You know, it's often cited as the year of the youthquake, when the popular culture tilted away from adult concerns, and we have the moments where, like you were talking about earlier, where we have grown adults being obsessed with what would otherwise be considered teeny bopper culture. I think literature probably took a little while to catch up with that. But one of the books that came out in '64 that I think really captures that sort of earlier period where we think of it as an adult culture. And I'm thinking particularly, you know, I have a lot of friends that are Mad Men fans.
I was just thinking Mad Men.
And they talk about sort of the idea of the earlier 60s of being that period of adulthood.
Well, the funny thing is in the Harriet the Spy, one of the things I read about it said that Harriet could be Max's older sister, Max from Where the Wild Things Are, except that she has both parents and they're right out of Mad Men. So yeah, there really was that blurring of the 60s, that adult drinking martinis, which is what Harriet's parents do through the whole book.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the awareness that children have a world of their own.
Right. One book we've been reading together for another project that we're doing is Patricia Highsmith's Two Faces of January, which just this year came out as a movie. And it's a fascinating sort of book. I think we're both kind of ambivalent about it in a lot of ways. But when I think of that sort of cleavage between adulthood and youth, to me, Highsmith is a writer that, even though she continued on writing all the way up into the 90s, but to me, I always associate her with that sort of late 50s, early 60s period, because these characters, even the younger ones, don't strike me as youth obsessed or being young.
Yeah, but if you look at when her movies were made, this is The Talented Mr. Ripley. Is one of those books where everybody goes, or movies. Oh, yeah, okay, I know who you're talking about now.
Yeah.
So The Talented Mr. Ripley, The Two Faces of January, which the other project is He Read, She Read on Troy Public Radio. So start listening for that. Just get in a plug when
There
we
you
get the
go.
chance. If you think about when that next step to the other medium was made, it wasn't until quite recently.
Right.
So in some ways, although you think of Patricia Highsmith's settings and characters as very much that late 50s, early 60s proprietary, I mean, proper, and the lines were clearly drawn, did it take us this long to be able to grapple with some of the darker elements? Like, I almost think of her going all the way back to like 30s and 40s.
Right, right.
Double Indemnity.
Yeah.
The Postman Always Rings Twice.
There's very much that sense. One of the things I love about the book is it has that sort of flavor, and Talented Mr. Ripley exploits this as well, that sort of flavor of expatriate decadence. That
Yes.
You could even carry that back even further to Henry James, where you have all these Americans kind of living abroad. And does living abroad as an expatriate make you go to pot, erode your
Or
morality?
does it move you outside of your normal restrictions so that, like, you know how kind of when you're on a plane, which I've been on a lot lately for many, many hours, and when you're flying through multiple time zones, you kind of feel like you're not, I was about to say not grounded, which obviously you're not, but you're kind of floating, like it's not really happening until you get back on the ground.
Yeah.
And I wonder if the idea of the expatriate, both in literature and maybe to some degree in real life, if when you are unmoored from the people that know you, your mom and your dad and your pastor or your rabbi or your principal or your second grade teacher, the people that would kind of keep an eye on you and make you behave.
Right.
When you get to some other place where the food and the air and the music and everything is uncertain, does that take away what normally binds us?
Yeah. It's a fascinating story, and I'll say that this is a dark book in terms of dark humor. There's a couple plot twists where when you hit them, you just go, I can't believe I'm reading what I'm reading. And it's not done graphically, or it's not exploited
we're not
in
talking
the way that,
Pulp Fiction.
Yeah,
I can't believe I'm laughing at this guy on the back of the cars.
But it does have a black humor sensibility, and interestingly enough, it was a book that her own publisher rejected 3 times. She could not soften this book enough for it to be published, and eventually the only way she got it in print was to change publishers. There's another one that I was going to mention too that I think is very indicative of the 60s sensibility as it grows up. And we mentioned this because this gentleman just died this past year, Thomas Berger. Little Big Man, most people probably remember it as
a miniseries.
And the Dustin Hoffman movie.
Oh, was it a miniseries, or did I make that up?
I'm thinking it. Well, I know it as a movie.
Okay, maybe it was a
from
movie
the early
that
70s.
I was too young to see.
Yeah, but it's Dustin Hoffman. If you haven't read this book, it's basically kind of Forrest Gump before Forrest Gump. I mean, but it's also an American tall tale. You've got a guy, aged guy, sort of spinning all these yarns about all of these historic moments in the West that he was involved in.
Neat.
And it really, it does a lot of neat things in terms of tapping into the Mark Twain tradition of the picaresque, or the journey, the adventure journey.
Now you're starting to sound like an English class.
Well, just lean over and slap me. But it's a fun book, and it's kind of, it really creates that sort of zany, it's very much in the flavor of what we think of as a kind of Kurt Vonnegut, or the Catch-22, Joseph Heller, or Ken Kesey, those sorts of, we often, I think, forget that literature in the 60s had a much more sort of, to use a term from the time, far out, sort of so bizarre I can't believe I'm reading this kind of comedy to it. It was serious, but
kind of like Monty Python.
Yeah, it was bizarre in that way.
What year was the movie?
Movie was 1970, and interestingly enough, when the book came out, and this is unfortunately true of most of Berger's books, the book came out, it you know, it did all right in a very small circle of readers. But it's his best-known book. He did a zillion others, and what's fascinating about him is he wrote in a lot of different genres. I mean, it was almost as if he took up science fiction or the Western or you know, noir, and really sort of flexed his muscles in a lot of different genres. But this is his best-known book, and it's best known because of the movie. I
Yeah, I
mean,
didn't know it was a
yeah.
book.
Well,
To me, it was. I discovered charades.
okay.
You know, about 6, 7, 8, and Little Big Man was one of my go-to.
There you go.
Charade.
There you go.
Plays. So you could kind of always know what I was going to do because it was like little, big. You know.
It's also part of that sort of wave of Western revisionism that came out, I think, in the kind of the post-John Wayne era, where people were retelling
Like
the
Sundance,
stories of
those
the
guys?
West. Yeah, yeah. The
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance
The
Kid?
movie's
I
very
did see
much
that
in the
movie.
sensibility of Butch Cassidy and all of those. So it's a fun read, and it's one that deserves to be rediscovered. Probably the most literary book of 1964, if we can make a pitch for one, is Saul Bellows' Herzog, which was the winner of the National Book Award that year. It's what we would call a book of ideas. Well, I think what's most interesting about it is, you know, plot-wise, I think most people would probably say it's kind of not a lot happens. It's about a guy who discovers his second wife is having an affair with his best friend, and their marriage breaks up. But throughout the book, it's a feel-good book. But throughout it, he writes letters to various people about art, about the Enlightenment, about ideas.
While he's wrestling with his
Yes.
dissolution
Yeah.
of his marriage.
And so it's
what
a
we
very,
all do.
It's a very
right,
conceptual.
Right before divorce court.
Well, it's interesting because this was actually a popular book. It sold reasonably well, believe it or not, and it's hard to imagine a book these days, I think, where people would seize upon these very rarefied intellectual ideas being discussable or worthy of discussion among anybody who's not the elite. So again, it gives us an idea, I think, of how different our culture may have been in that period. So those are, we've flown through a lot of books.
We had a lot
I
of
mean,
books.
We're kind
If you
of,
can't find something to read out of this bunch,
exactly.
surely.
So we'll just end it by reminding people that the next year that we're going to do is one of the other historic ones from 1960s. We're going to jump right ahead to 1969, and we're going to talk about it in part because that's
It's my birth year, and it was also pivotal. But before we do that, next episode, if I get to twist your arm, is father-son reading list for the holidays that also have movies.
That's right. We're going to do some Christmas recommendations. Since we're coming up on that season.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
And as always, it flies.
Hope y'all enjoyed it.
We'll say thank you very much and hope to see you in our next episode.